A curious teenager ventured into an abandoned cave, expecting to find only dust and silence. But deep inside, he stumbled upon a terrifying secret that had been hidden in the darkness for decades. A secret that was never meant to be discovered. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The small mining town of Stoneford had a way of wearing down the people who stayed in it. The clapboard houses sat faded under the relentless sun, their paint flaking like old scabs. Weeds claimed the cracks in the sidewalks, and the rusted iron rails of the disused spur line ran like a scar through the center of town. It was a place built on hard work and hard luck, where the boom had come and gone decades ago, leaving only the hollow shells of its glory days. The miner's statue still stood in the square, a granite figure of a man gripping a pickaxe, staring toward the hills. But the bronze plaque beneath it was streaked with green corrosion, the names of those who'd given their lives underground nearly unreadable. When the wind came down from the ridges, it carried with it the faint smell of iron and dust, a ghostly reminder of the ore that had once made Stoneford worth something. For 16-year-old Jaden Hale, those smells were more than just the town's background. They were his family's history, etched deep into his blood. His great-grandfather had come here when the mines were first opened, lured by the promise of steady wages and a roof over his head. His grandfather had been a foreman in the largest shaft, the one everyone simply called Deepwater. And his father. His father had died 5 years ago in what the official reports called a workplace accident. A rock fall in an unstable section of tunnel, they said. Quick and merciful, they insisted. But Jaden's mother never believed the quick part, and Jaden had never believed the accident. His mother worked nights at the county hospital in the next town over, catching short naps in the day before heading back for another shift. She was a strong woman, but there was always a weariness about her now, like she'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. Jaden had learned early on to take care of himself, to keep his grades up, and to find his own ways to fill the hours when the house was quiet. Sometimes that meant hanging out with other kids, most of whom shared the same mix of boredom and restlessness. But more often, it meant slipping away into the edges of the hills, exploring the remains of a world that had been abandoned before he was even born. Jaden had a fascination with the forgotten places. The more decayed, the better. Old barns with their roofs sagging in the middle, the rusting husks of mining equipment half buried in dirt, a collapsed storehouse where he'd once found a tattered ledger still listing supplies from 1978. He carried a battered notebook where he sketched what he saw and jotted down notes, sometimes whole pages of questions to himself about who had left these things behind and why. His phone was full of pictures, jagged holes in the earth, weathered warning signs, strange graffiti left on crumbling walls. He didn't think of it as dangerous so much as honest. Abandoned places didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. It was while digging through the attic of his grandfather's old house that he found it. The attic smelled of dry wood and dust, the air so still it felt heavy in his lungs. He'd gone up there looking for a box of old comic books he thought might still be hidden among the trunks and crates. Instead, he found the leather-bound notebook. It was lying at the bottom of a tin trunk beneath a bundle of moth-eaten work shirts. The cover was worn smooth at the edges, the leather cracked and darkened with age. His grandfather's cramped handwriting filled the pages in a looping script that leaned hard to the right. Most of it was about the day-to-day grind of mining. Shifts, equipment checks, quarrels between men, weather reports. But then, toward the back, the entries changed. The words Sandstone Cave appeared several times, underlined in thick pencil. Beside the name were notes that made Jaden's brow furrow. Avoid, at all costs, No one should go there alone. And one, written in letters so jagged they tore slightly through the page. It's not safe, not because of the rock. There were dates scrawled in the margins: 1973, 1979, 1984. Each one crossed through with a hard line. He didn't know why, but the sight of them made his pulse quicken. It felt like he was looking at something his grandfather hadn't wanted anyone else to read. When he asked his mother later, she only shook her head. "Your granddad saw things in those hills that bothered him," she said, her voice low. "Some places just have bad luck, Jay. Best to leave them be." That was the end of the conversation. She would not be drawn into saying more, no matter how he pressed. But the idea of Sandstone Cave dug into his mind and stayed there. He thought about the name during classes, seeing it written across his notebook margins before he realized he was even doing it. He remembered whispers he'd overheard in town, stories about people who had gone missing on the hillsides, hunters who had returned pale and shaken, claiming to have heard strange noises underground. Old men in the corner booth of Benny's Diner sometimes swapped tales of lights moving in the darkness, of voices calling from nowhere. It was all the kind of talk people laughed off as nonsense, but Jaden noticed they laughed too quickly, like they were trying to drown out something they didn't want to believe. One night, walking home from a friend's place, he caught sight of it for himself. Up on the distant slope, where the black outline of Sandstone Hill cut against the stars, a flicker of light danced. It was faint and far away, and it vanished before he could be certain. But it was enough. Someone was up there. Doing what, he didn't know, but the thought that it might be connected to the warnings in his grandfather's notebook lit a fuse inside him. The next morning, he started planning. He gathered his gear the way he always did before an exploration. The heavy-duty flashlight with a spare set of batteries wrapped in plastic, his camera, leather work gloves, a battered compass he'd found at a yard sale, his notebook, and a pen clipped to his shirt. He chose his oldest jeans and a thick canvas jacket, the kind that could take being scraped against rock without tearing too badly. In the front pocket of his backpack, he tucked a small water bottle and a packet of jerky. He didn't know how far he'd go inside. He'd tell himself he was just going to take a look, maybe get some photos, but he knew better than to head out unprepared. Still, as he lay awake that night listening to the tick of the old wall clock in his room, he felt the edge of something sharper than curiosity. His grandfather's warning, his mother's refusal to talk, the stories that clung to Sandstone like a shadow. There was a pattern here, and if he was right, it wasn't just about bad luck. He told himself he'd be careful, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. Whatever was in that cave had been waiting a long time, and now it felt like it was waiting for him. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept across the hills, Jaden was up and dressed. He slipped out the back door, the backpack slung over one shoulder, and started down the narrow path that would take him out of town and into the low, scrub-covered foothills. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of morning where every sound seemed louder, every detail clearer. Somewhere up ahead, hidden behind the brush and stone, was Sandstone Cave. And Jaden Hale was going to find it. The trail leading out of Stoneford wound its way through a patchwork of low, thorny shrubs and sunburnt grass, its course so familiar to Jaden that he could have walked it with his eyes closed. Yet this morning it felt different. Each crunch of gravel under his boots seemed to echo. Every shift of wind through the dry leaves carried a sharper edge. He had told himself he was heading toward nothing more than an old curiosity, a piece of family history that needed a closer look, but the truth was less comfortable. He was moving toward something his grandfather had feared enough to commit to paper, and even in the pale morning light, that knowledge weighed on him. The air smelled faintly of rust and sage as he left behind the last outlying houses. Ahead, the hills rose like the vertebrae of some long-buried beast, their slopes dotted with stubborn juniper and the gray, brittle remains of trees that hadn't survived the last drought. Somewhere beyond the nearest ridge lay Sandstone Hill, and at its base, the cave. The walk wasn't long, 2 miles, maybe 3, but it carried him across a landscape that had seen more than its share of hard years. Along the way, he passed the skeletal frames of old mining carts half swallowed by earth, their wheels frozen in place by decades of neglect. A length of frayed cable dangled from a leaning power pole, its shadow stretching across the ground like a dead snake. The sun had climbed higher by the time he reached the narrower portion of the trail where the land pinched together. Here, the path dipped into a shallow gully, and it was there that he saw them. Prints. He crouched, balancing on the balls of his feet, and brushed his fingers across the dirt. The impressions were crisp, the edges of the tread patterns clear, the soil still slightly damp from last night's brief rain. Heavy boots, maybe work boots, and not just one pair. 2 sets at least, maybe 3, moving toward the same destination he was. They weren't old, no more than a day or 2. That meant he wasn't the only one with business near Sandstone Hill. He rose slowly, scanning the ridge lines, the thickets of brush, the pockets of shadow beneath the few remaining trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation that someone could be out here watching him threaded itself through his thoughts. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, the weight of his camera and flashlight a sudden reassurance, and kept walking. The first sight of Sandstone Hill came as he crested the gully's far side. From this angle, the slope rose at a gentle incline before hardening into a jagged ridge of pale stone. Weather and time had gnawed at it, leaving sharp outcroppings and loose scree that shifted underfoot. As he drew closer, the land seemed to quiet around him. Even the wind died down, leaving only the crunch of his boots and the slow rhythm of his breathing. It didn't take long to find the entrance. Half hidden by a curtain of wild sage and tumbleweed, it might have been overlooked entirely if not for the unnatural line of shadow that cut across the slope. Stepping closer, Jaden saw that the opening was partially blocked by a haphazard barricade of splintered boards and rocks. The wood was sun-bleached, its nails rusted to a dull red, but some of the stones looked freshly disturbed, their undersides still clean of dust. Whoever had blocked the entrance had done so years ago, but someone else had started undoing that work. The same boot prints he'd seen in the gully marked the ground here, pressed deep into the soil before vanishing into the dark mouth of the cave. He stood there for a long moment, studying it. The boards leaned inward at odd angles, leaving gaps big enough to slip through. Beyond, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the sunlight before it had a chance to touch the walls. He could smell it from here, the damp mineral scent of stone mixed with something faintly metallic. His grandfather's warnings stirred again in his mind, but so did the memory of that flickering light he'd seen on the hillside. Curiosity won. It always did. Shifting his pack, he pulled out the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow cone through the gloom, revealing the first few feet of uneven ground. He ducked through the gap in the barricade, his shoulders brushing against the boards, and felt the temperature drop almost instantly. The air inside was still and cool, wrapping around him like a damp cloth. The first chamber was exactly what he expected. rough stone walls scarred by the marks of pickaxes and drills, the remnants of support beams rotting where they leaned against the corners. Old timbers had collapsed into splinters across the floor, and puddles of stagnant water reflected the light back at him in broken patches. He moved carefully, placing each step where the ground seemed solid, listening to the faint, distant drip of water from somewhere deeper in. As he pressed on, the character of the cave began to change. The old mining tunnels, their ceilings low and claustrophobic, gave way to passages that felt fresher. The walls were smoother, the floor less cluttered with debris. He shone his light across one section and frowned. The marks here weren't from a pickaxe. They were straighter, cleaner, as if cut by newer tools. The edges of some rocks still held a paler color, not yet dulled by years of exposure. Whoever had been working here had done so recently. A few 100 feet in, he came across the remains of a campsite tucked into a recess in the wall. A small ring of blackened stones held the ashes of a fire, cold but not entirely gray. An open can lay on its side nearby, its label half burned, the metal inside still smelling faintly of beans. A coil of rope leaned against the wall, its fibers dry and free of dust, and an empty cement bag lay crumpled in the corner. He knelt and touched it. No moisture had seeped in. This had been left here not weeks, but days ago. Jaden took out his camera and snapped a series of photos. The campfire, the rope, the cement bag. He took close-ups of the rope fibers and the tread marks where someone had set down heavy boots near the wall. Then he noticed something else, just at the edge of his beam. A large, irregular shape that didn't quite match the surrounding rock. Stepping closer, he realized it was a metal crate, and its surface painted in a mottled pattern to mimic stone. Dust clung to its edges, but faint scratches suggested it had been moved, maybe even opened more than once. Beside it, a jagged spur of rock jutted out from the wall. Caught on its edge was a scrap of dark fabric, frayed and stiff. He tugged at it gently. It tore free with a faint rip. Holding it up to the light, he saw that it was part of a heavy jacket, the kind worn by workers or hunters. The edges were uneven, as though it had been caught on the rock during a sudden movement. Another photo, another entry in his notebook. The deeper he went, the more that uneasy sensation crept in, the one that had started back at the gully. It wasn't fear exactly, but a prickle at the base of his neck, an instinct that told him the space around him wasn't empty. He paused more often now, listening between breaths, scanning the shadows beyond the flashlight's reach. The air felt heavier, as if the cave itself were holding its breath. Yet the path continued to draw him onward. The smooth-walled corridor ahead dipped slightly, curving out of sight, and some part of him felt certain that whatever lay around that bend would explain everything. His grandfather's warnings, the strange lights, the fresh signs of human presence in a place that should have been deserted. Adjusting his grip on the flashlight, he took a steadying breath and stepped forward into the narrowing dark. The passage tightened as Jaden moved forward, the beam of his flashlight jittering against the walls with each step. The stone here felt different beneath his boots, more compacted and dry, as though this section of the cave had been sealed off from the elements for a long time. He had to angle his shoulders to fit through a pinch point where the walls nearly touched, scraping the side of his jacket against the cold rock. Beyond that, the tunnel opened into a chamber that seemed larger than anything he had passed through so far, its ceiling lost in darkness above the reach of his light. The air was colder here and heavier, as though it had been trapped for years without movement. The first thing that caught his eye was the heap of stone in the center of the chamber. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a natural rockfall, the sort of thing that happened when time and gravity did their work. But the longer he stared at it, the less natural it seemed. The rocks weren't scattered randomly, they were stacked, and there was a certain deliberate symmetry to the pile. Edging closer, he swept his light across the base and froze. Something dark and ragged protruded from between two of the larger stones, a piece of fabric, worn thin but still holding its shape. He hesitated only a moment before crouching down. The flashlight's beam revealed that the cloth was attached to something buried deeper under the rocks. Setting the light on the ground, he leaned forward and began to work the stones loose, moving the smaller ones first, shifting his weight carefully so he wouldn't send the pile collapsing into itself. The rocks were cold and damp to the touch, leaving grit under his fingernails. One by one, he peeled them back until the beam of light struck something metallic. The object was small, oval, and dulled by a thin crust of rust. As he brushed away more debris, its shape became clear. A badge. He picked it up carefully, wiping the dirt from its surface with the cuff of his sleeve. The words, though faint, could still be read. Federal Mine Inspector. Beneath that was a name he didn't recognize, but the official seal stamped into the metal was unmistakable. He'd seen enough documentaries and old photos to know what he was holding was no ordinary identification. This was federal, and it wasn't supposed to be here, hidden under a pile of rocks in a remote section of a cave no one admitted to visiting. His heart was already hammering when he uncovered the rest. Another rock shifted under his hand, and something pale came into view, a curve of bone. The breath caught in his throat. It took a moment for his mind to register what his eyes were seeing, but when it did, the recognition landed with a weight that made his stomach twist. A skull lay half buried in the rubble, its jaw slack, eye sockets hollow and black. The surface of the bone was mottled with age, but otherwise intact except for a single, perfectly round hole at the back of the cranium. It was so clean it looked surgical. Jaden didn't need a crime show to tell him what that meant. Someone had put a bullet in this man's head from close range. He sat back hard on his heels, the sound of his breathing loud in the chamber. This wasn't an old miner who had been caught in a collapse a century ago. The clothes, though torn and dirt-caked, were modern enough, the fabric still holding together where true age would have rotted it away. The badge was barely rusted, and the documents he could now see tucked in a weathered leather folder beside the body were dry. Too dry for something that had been here for decades. Reaching for the folder, he pulled it free from the stones, the leather stiff but intact. The clasp was broken, so it opened easily in his hands. Inside were folded maps, marked with precise lines and notes in tight handwriting. Some were diagrams of the mine's original tunnels, but others showed new passages, ones that had no official labels. There were lists of materials, cement, explosives, ventilation equipment, and pages that looked like inspection reports, except the data was clearly fabricated. He saw photographs, too, black and white prints of what appeared to be freshly dug shafts and crates stacked in hidden alcoves. One photo showed ore samples, labeled with a mineral name he recognized from science class as rare and valuable. Another page bore columns of numbers beside names of what looked like companies or individuals. Jaden didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. Someone was running an illegal operation out here, and this inspector had found out. A faint sound pricked his ears, making him freeze. It was soft at first, like the scrape of fabric against stone, but then it came again, Louder this time. A footstep. His eyes darted to the narrow tunnel he'd entered through, and for a moment he thought he saw the faintest tremor of light reflecting off the stone. Voices followed, distant but growing clearer, their echoes twisting in the dark. Jaden's grip on the folder tightened. He snatched up his flashlight, clicking it off instinctively, and the chamber plunged into complete darkness. In the black, his other senses flared. He could hear the crunch of boots on loose gravel, the way the sound grew sharper as whoever it was drew closer. The voices were male, at least 2 of them, maybe 3. The words were muffled by the way the cave carried sound, but he could make out enough to know they were talking about the stash and making sure it's undisturbed. The tone wasn't casual. It carried a clipped urgency that made his pulse race. Whoever they were, they belonged here, and they were checking on something they didn't want found. Jaden backed away from the rock pile as quietly as he could, feeling his way toward the far wall. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew the tunnel behind them was the only exit he'd come through. If they reached the chamber before he found another way, they would trap him here, and the folder in his hands would tell them exactly how much he'd seen. He slid 1 foot along the wall, his free hand brushing the stone, searching for any break, any crack that might lead somewhere else. The voices were closer now, clearer. One man laughed low under his breath. Another's voice was sharper, older, with a rasp that carried authority. "We keep this place clean, and no one will ever know," the man said, the words bouncing off the stone in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where he stood. Jaden's chest tightened. The sound of boots scuffing the floor came next, then the faint thud of something being set down. He pressed his fingers into a narrow gap at shoulder height and felt the faint rush of cool air. Hope flared. He didn't know where it led or whether he could fit, but it was a way out, or at least a place to hide. Hugging the folder to his chest, he crouched and pushed his flashlight into the crook of his arm to keep it from clattering. The opening was narrow, its edges rough and jagged. He wedged his shoulders in first, twisting to get his hips through, the stone biting through his jacket. Behind him, the glow of lantern light began to bleed into the chamber, and a man's voice said, "Start with the back. If anything's been moved, it'll be there." Jaden's breath caught. They were seconds away from seeing the disturbed pile of rocks. His knee scraped painfully against the stone, but he kept moving, pulling himself through inch by inch. A rock snagged the strap of his backpack, yanking him backward, and he had to wrench free with a force that made a small cascade of pebbles clatter to the floor. The noise echoed like a gunshot. He heard one of the men stop speaking mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" a voice said. Jaden didn't wait to hear the answer. He shoved himself forward with everything he had, the gap tearing at his clothes, his knuckles raw from gripping the stone. His only thought was to put as much distance between himself and that chamber as possible. The cool draft on his face told him the gap opened somewhere ahead, and he crawled faster, ignoring the sting of cuts and the ache in his shoulders. Behind him, the voices rose in pitch, no longer muffled but sharp with alarm. One of them barked an order to check the side tunnel. The passage ahead dipped sharply, and Jaden nearly slid the last few feet before catching himself on a protruding rock. The floor leveled out, and he forced himself forward into darkness, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. The folder dug into his ribs, but he clung to it, knowing it was the only thing between what he'd found and it disappearing forever. The air grew fresher, telling him there was another opening nearby, but it also meant he was leaving behind the one place he'd had to gather himself. Now, it was just him, the evidence, and the men in the dark who already knew someone had been there. He didn't look back. The draft grew stronger the further Jaden dragged himself along the cramped tunnel, the air biting at his cheeks as if urging him forward. The sound of his own breathing mingled with the shuffle of his knees and elbows against the stone, and every scrape seemed to echo too loudly, like a flare in the silence. Somewhere behind him, back in the chamber with the rock pile, the men's voices had shifted. They were no longer talking about maintenance or supplies. They were asking questions. Short, clipped sentences followed by pauses that meant they were listening for him. The folder pressed tight against his ribs was both a comfort and a curse. Its edges jabbed into him each time he shifted, but letting go wasn't an option. He had no idea who the inspector had been beyond the badge, no idea how long he'd been buried under those stones, but he knew one thing without doubt. This was the kind of truth that could disappear forever if it ended up in the wrong hands. And right now, the wrong hands were no more than 30 feet behind him. He kept moving, ignoring the burning in his shoulders. The walls narrowed again, forcing him to turn his head sideways so his helmetless skull didn't crack against the rock above. The smell of the cave was changing too. The deeper chambers had smelled of old stone and damp, but here the air was cleaner, sharper, laced with the faint scent of sun-warmed plants. That was the promise he needed. Somewhere ahead, there had to be an exit. A sudden clatter rang out behind him, and Jaden froze. Pebbles skittered across stone. Someone had followed his path into the narrow passage. The voice that called out next was muffled by the rock, but the tone carried clearly enough, confident, certain. "He's in here. I can hear him." Jaden's pulse slammed against his ribs. He forced himself to keep going, but faster now, scraping his knees raw as he clawed at the floor for leverage. His boots caught on the uneven surface, and for a panicked second, he thought he'd be stuck there, wedged like a rat. Then his heel cleared the snag, and he was crawling again, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg. The glow of his flashlight, still gripped under his arm, flashed against something ahead. A jagged, vertical seam in the stone where the light seemed to dance differently. He lunged toward it, pushing the beam forward, and saw the faintest shimmer of daylight bleeding through. The crack was too small for him to walk through, but maybe, just maybe, he could squeeze out if he took off his pack. He twisted awkwardly, one arm reaching back to slide the straps from his shoulders. The backpack fell against his legs, and he kicked it forward until it landed ahead of him. The folder he kept tucked inside his jacket, too important to risk losing, while the flashlight rolled against his chest. He shoved the pack through the gap first, then flattened himself as much as he could and began to wriggle through. The rock scraped his cheek, tore a line through his jacket sleeve, and, for a moment, the stone pressed so close on either side that he couldn't draw a full breath. The voices behind him grew louder, sharper now, as if the men had realized they were running out of time to catch him. "Don't let him get to the outside," one barked, and boots pounded against the stone in a desperate rhythm. Jaden's shoulders cleared the gap with a sharp, painful jerk, and then he was pulling himself free, spilling out into a shallow depression behind a cluster of massive boulders. The sunlight hit him like a shock after the cave's gloom, and he squinted against the brightness. His knees met loose dirt and grit, but the air, God, the air was fresh and alive in a way that made his head spin. He yanked the backpack through after him, slinging it over one shoulder, and crouched low. The boulders shielded him from view of the main hillside, but he could still hear the faint echo of the men's shouts from inside the cave. A quick glance through a slit between the rocks revealed the main entrance to Sandstone Cave a quarter-mile away. 3 horses were tied to a post near the mouth, their reins hanging slack, tails flicking at flies. 2 men stood in the sunlight, one scanning the tree line with binoculars while the other leaned casually on a rifle. Jaden ducked back behind the rocks, pressing his spine into the cool stone. If they caught sight of him now, he'd have no chance. He needed to put as much distance between himself and the hill as possible without drawing attention. The slope on the far side of the boulders dipped into a narrow ravine choked with scrub and sage. If he could get into that cover, he might be able to work his way down toward town unseen. A sharp burst of laughter carried from the main entrance, and Jaden risked one more look. The man with the binoculars had turned toward the cave mouth, gesturing with a tilt of his head. The rifleman followed, both stepping inside. That was his chance. He slid out from behind the boulders and moved quickly, but low, half running, half crouching, the dry brush scratching at his jeans. His heartbeat roared in his ears, each step an eternity until the land finally folded around him and the side of the cave entrance vanished behind a ridge. He didn't stop moving, following the ravine as it wound down the hillside, each bend taking him further from the men who would, by now, be combing the interior for any sign of him. The closer he got to town, the more his mind raced ahead. What was he supposed to do with what he had found? The sheriff was out of the question. Everybody in Stoneford knew Sheriff Kane owed his position to favors from the town's wealthiest. And it wasn't just Kane. The mayor dined at their tables, and half the businesses in town relied on their contracts. The inspector's murder was more than a crime. It was a message. Someone with power had made sure it would stay hidden. He slowed only when the first rooftops came into view beyond the ridge. The sunlight was beginning to tilt toward late afternoon, casting long shadows across the dirt roads and faded clapboard facades. People moved about their business, hauling feed sacks, sweeping porches, talking in pairs at the corner by the post office, completely unaware of the danger that lay a few miles away. Jaden slipped around the back of the old schoolhouse, the building's white paint blistered and peeling. The basement door was locked, but the window beside it had been loose for years. He eased it open, the frame groaning softly, and slid inside. The air was stale, tinged with the smell of dust and paper. In the corner, behind a row of dented metal filing cabinets, was the perfect place. He pulled the cabinet just far enough to wedge the folder into the narrow gap between it and the wall, then shoved the cabinet back into place. It wasn't much, but it would do until he could think of somewhere better. Only then did he allow himself to breathe deeply. He was safe for the moment, but the knowledge of how quickly that could change sat heavy in his gut. Somewhere up on that hill, men were still searching for him, and they wouldn't stop just because they'd lost sight of him once. He had something they would risk anything to reclaim, and sooner or later they'd realize he'd made it to town. The scrape of tires outside drew him to the window. A gray pickup rolled slowly down the street, its engine barely above a purr. It passed the school without stopping, but Jaden felt the prickle of certainty crawl across his skin. He'd seen that truck twice already on his way back, once parked near the feed store, once idling at the end of an alley. They were looking for him. He ducked back from the window, pressing his back to the wall, and closed his eyes. He couldn't stay hidden forever. If he wanted to survive, and if he wanted the truth about that inspector to see daylight, he was going to have to make his next move soon. By the time he stepped out into the lengthening shadows of the street, he knew two things for certain. He was in more danger than he had ever imagined, and he wasn't going to stop until someone heard the story buried under Sandstone Hill. The evening sun was sliding low over Stoneford, bathing the tired buildings in a warm orange glow that did nothing to ease the knot in Jaden's stomach. He kept his head down as he moved along the narrow back streets, his senses stretched tight as piano wire. Every shadow felt like it might hide a watcher. Every creak of wood or crunch of gravel seemed louder than it should. The gray pickup had circled the streets twice since he'd first spotted it, and though it hadn't slowed near him again, he knew better than to believe it was a coincidence. They were looking for him, and the men from the cave weren't the kind to stop just because they'd lost sight of him in daylight. His feet carried him on instinct toward the older part of town, where alleys twisted between buildings that had been patched so many times their original shapes were hard to guess. The air smelled faintly of dust and old oil from the machine shop, and the buzz of a faulty street lamp echoed against the brick walls. He ducked into the shadow of a recessed doorway, letting a pair of women walk past without noticing him, then continued toward the one place he thought might keep his secret for now. The school basement had served him well for hiding the folder, but it wasn't a permanent solution. He needed to buy time, and the only way to do that was to keep moving. Still, his legs were aching from the climb down the hill, his hands sore and scraped from the crawl through the rock, and the weight of what he'd found was settling heavy on his shoulders. He thought of the inspector's badge, the clean bullet hole in the skull, the careful stack of stones. It was all too deliberate to be chance. Whoever had killed that man hadn't just wanted him dead, they'd wanted him erased. And now Jaden had stumbled into the middle of it. As he cut across a side street, his eye caught movement in a second-floor window. A curtain twitched just enough to suggest someone had been watching. He didn't slow down, but his heartbeat quickened. This town wasn't big enough to disappear in for long. Everyone knew everyone else's face, and even if they didn't know his name, word would spread quickly about a boy skulking around like he had something to hide. He made his way toward Main Street, where the brick facades of the few remaining shops faced the wide dirt road. A couple of cars rolled past, and an old farmer on a rusted bicycle lifted a hand in lazy greeting. Jaden forced himself to nod back, though his eyes kept scanning for that truck. Across the street, the door to the library stood open to let in the breeze. The familiar scent of old paper drifted out, and he felt a flicker of relief. If there was anyone in town who might give him a straight answer, or at least not turn him in, it was Mrs. Ellis, the librarian. Inside, the light was softer, the air cool. Mrs. Ellis was at the front desk, her silver hair pinned up, a pair of reading glasses perched low on her nose as she stamped a stack of returned books. She looked up at him over the frames, and her brow furrowed slightly. "You look like you've been in a fight with a barbed wire fence," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that had a way of settling people down. Jaden didn't answer right away, just stepped closer to the desk. The library was empty, the only sound the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. "I need to ask you something," he murmured. "Something important." She studied him for a long moment before setting the stamp down. Her eyes flicked to the empty doorway, then back to him. "Not here," she said, and gestured toward the stacks. They walked together down an aisle lined with history books, the smell of aged paper growing stronger. At the back, she stopped beside the door to the archive room and unlocked it. Inside, the room was dim except for a small lamp on a filing cabinet, its circle of light illuminating dust motes drifting in the air. "What is it, Jaden?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. Finally, he said, "I found something in the hills. Something bad. And I think the people looking for me will hurt anyone who gets in their way." Her face didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "Then you'd best stay away from the sheriff," she said, "and the mayor, and probably half the town council." He nodded grimly. "I figured. I heard the federal prosecutor's coming here soon, though. Do you know where he stays?" She didn't answer right away, then sighed. "When Judge Harris comes through, he usually stays out at Simon Walker's ranch. Simon doesn't take kindly to some folks in this town, especially the ones you're probably talking about." That gave Jaden something like hope, though it was thin. Walker's ranch was on the far side of town, a good walk in daylight, and even farther if he had to stick to back routes. But if he could get there before the men in the truck found him, maybe he'd have a chance to hand over the folder to someone who could use it. Mrs. Ellis seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't go tonight unless you can be sure you're not being followed," she warned. "They'll have eyes on every road out of here." He left the library by the back door, stepping into a narrow alley where the sun no longer reached. The shadows felt thicker here, and the brick walls rose on either side like canyon cliffs. Somewhere to his left, a bottle clinked against the pavement. He quickened his pace, emerging onto another side street just as the gray pickup rolled slowly past the far corner. Its windows were tinted dark enough to hide the faces inside, but Jaden could feel their attention sweep over the street like a searchlight. He ducked into the doorway of a boarded-up shop and waited until the sound of the engine faded. Moving again, he kept to the edges of buildings, slipping behind parked cars and cutting across yards when he could. The smell of grilling meat drifted from somewhere ahead, and he caught sight of a family gathered on a porch, laughing over their plates. It struck him how normal they looked, how removed from the rot sitting just beneath the surface of this place. He wondered how many of them knew the truth, or if they would even believe it if they heard it. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the sky had deepened to a richer blue, the first hints of night gathering in the east. The Walker Ranch lay beyond the low ridge ahead, but the open ground between here and there made his skin crawl. He'd have to time it right, moving when the road was empty, trusting the long grass and the dips in the earth to hide him. A flicker of movement behind him made him glance back. At the far end of the street, the gray pickup had returned, its headlights off. It was creeping forward, slow and deliberate. Jaden's pulse kicked into high gear. He slipped into the nearest yard, vaulted a low fence, and cut across a patch of weeds toward a gap between two sheds. The space was tight, the wood walls pressing close, but it funneled him out into another alley. He broke into a jog, weaving through the maze of back streets until he reached the rear of the feed store. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath, and listened. The sound of the truck was gone for now, but he knew that didn't mean he was safe. They were hunting him, methodically, the same way they must have hunted the inspector before putting him in that cave. The thought stiffened his resolve. He wasn't going to end up like that, silent, hidden, and forgotten. If he could reach Walker, if he could get that folder into Harris's hands, then maybe the truth would finally drag itself into the light. Jaden adjusted the straps of his backpack and stepped out into the twilight, keeping to the darkest parts of the road. The game was dangerous now, more dangerous than anything he'd faced before, but the rules were simple enough. Stay unseen, stay ahead, and don't let go of the evidence. Somewhere in the night ahead was the only chance he had to survive and to make sure the inspector's death hadn't been for nothing. And, as the street lamps flickered to life one by one, He disappeared into the shadows, moving toward whatever waited for him beyond the ridge. Night had settled over Stoneford like a heavy blanket, muting the last colors from the sky until everything beyond the street lamps was a wash of shadow and moonlight. Jaden moved through it as carefully as he knew how, letting the darkness swallow him but never trusting it completely. The quiet was deceptive. Behind it lurked the hum of engines on distant roads, the occasional crunch of tires over gravel, the soft bark of a dog somewhere too far away to be a threat. Every sound was measured, catalogued, and stored in his mind as he picked his way through the town's edges towards the ridge that separated him from the Walker Ranch. The streets were emptier now, but that only made the appearance of any vehicle more obvious. Twice he had to duck behind hedges when a car rolled past, both times holding his breath until the taillights disappeared. He couldn't be sure if they were looking for him or just taking the long way home, but he wasn't willing to gamble on finding out. His legs ached from the constant stop-and-start pace, the adrenaline wearing grooves into his nerves. The weight of the folder pressed against his chest under his jacket like a reminder of every risk he'd taken since entering that cave. It wasn't just a burden anymore. It was a promise, and the thought of failing to keep it clenched his jaw tighter than the cold air. He stuck to alleys and side yards, letting fences and outbuildings block him from any clear line of sight from the street. But the town was changing around him now. The tidy porches and storefronts of Main Street had given way to empty lots and outlying barns, the gaps between houses widening until they no longer overlapped. Out here, cover was harder to come by. The moon, still climbing, cast long shadows that shifted with every movement, and Jaden had to remind himself not to break into a run across open ground no matter how much the exposed space made his skin crawl. Running drew attention. Running was what prey did when it realized the hunter was close. He paused at the edge of a wide field, crouched low behind the rotten frame of an old fence. The grass here came up to his thighs, rustling softly when the wind passed through. Beyond it, the ridge loomed, its silhouette sharp against the faintly glowing horizon. On the other side lay the Walker Ranch, and if Mrs. Ellis had been right, the one person who might shield him long enough to get the folder into the right hands. It looked close, but the ground between him and safety was open, with no more than a scatter of scrub to hide behind. He would have to time it perfectly. Then he heard it, the low growl of an engine, faint but rising steadily in volume. He froze, lowering himself further into the grass. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the soft crunch of tires over the dirt road that paralleled the field. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the dark until they caught a shape moving just beyond the last house's edge. The gray pickup. Even in the dim light, he recognized its squat, deliberate crawl, the way it hugged the road, as if searching for something that might appear just outside its beams. The windows were as black as ever, but he could feel the weight of whoever sat inside. Jaden didn't move until the truck rolled past and disappeared around a bend. Even then, he waited, counting slow, steady breaths until he was sure it wasn't about to circle back. Only then did he slide along the fence line, keeping low, and make for the far end of the field where an old line of trees offered a narrow corridor of darkness toward the ridge. Each step was careful, deliberate, the soft earth muffling his footsteps. The moon broke through the clouds overhead, and for a moment, the grass around him glowed silver. He clenched his teeth, knowing the open light could give him away, and quickened his pace toward the safety of the trees. He had almost reached them when the sound of another engine split the quiet. This one was closer, sharper, the gears shifting as if the driver had just taken a turn too fast. Jaden darted into the shadows beneath the first line of trunks and crouched low, listening. The vehicle slowed, the hum deepening, and then a beam of light cut across the grass in a wide arc. It swept once, twice, before disappearing. He realized then they weren't just patrolling, they were searching the fields now. They were tightening the net. Keeping to the trees, he moved parallel to the road, climbing steadily toward the ridge. Branches snagged at his jacket, and roots reached for his boots in the dark, but he didn't dare slow. He could see the outline of the rise now, the path where the ground narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. The climb would be harder there, but it would also shield him from any light below. Halfway up, he risked a glance back. A pair of headlights had stopped on the road, pointed directly at the field he'd crossed. Two figures stood beside the truck, their outlines dark against the pale grass. Even at this distance, Jaden recognized the broad-shouldered one from the cave. His stance was the same, steady and sure, a man used to being obeyed. The other was shorter, leaner, but the way he moved carried the same quiet confidence. They weren't guessing. They knew he was out here somewhere. Jaden ducked behind the rocks and kept climbing. The cold air burned in his lungs, but he welcomed the ache. It meant he was still moving, still ahead. Near the top, the ground leveled, and he found himself looking down the far side of the ridge toward the dark expanse of the Walker property. The ranch stretched wide in the moonlight, dotted with low buildings and the faint glow of porch lamps in the distance. Relief fluttered in his chest, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the last stretch would be the most dangerous. He would be visible crossing that open ground, and if they reached the ridge before he was out of sight, they could cut him off. He started down the slope, keeping to the shadows where the moonlight didn't reach. The descent was faster, but loose stones shifted under his boots, sending small cascades of gravel tumbling ahead of him. Each sound made him wince, but the ranch was closer with every step. He could see the fence line now, the weathered posts leaning slightly, the rails silvered by years of sun and wind. Just beyond it, a gravel drive wound toward the cluster of buildings where a single figure moved between the porch light and the barn. Jaden reached the fence and ducked low, slipping between two rails without slowing. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he made for the porch, the weight of the folder a steady thud against his chest. Halfway there, the distant rumble of an engine carried over the ridge. He didn't look back. Every step now was focused on the door ahead, the rectangle of warm light spilling across the ground. The man on the porch turned as Jaden approached, a tall figure with a weathered face and the kind of stance that came from decades of work on the land. His eyes narrowed as he took in the boy's appearance, dirty, scratched, and breathing hard, but he didn't speak right away. Jaden slowed, catching his breath just enough to say, "I need to see Judge Harris. It's about something in the hills, something dangerous." The man's expression didn't change much, but he gave a single nod and stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. The light was warmer here, the walls lined with framed photographs of cattle drives and rodeos long past. Jaden followed the man down a short hall, the sound of his boots muffled by the worn runner underfoot. At the end of the hall, a door stood open to a room where two men sat at a table. One, older and sharp-eyed, looked up as they entered, and Jaden knew without being told that this was Judge Harris. He hadn't planned what to say, there hadn't been time, but the words came in a rush. He told them about the cave, about the inspector's badge, the folder, the men who had chased him since he'd left the hills. He didn't leave out the part about the gunshot hole in the skull or the fact that the documents in his possession proved something illegal was happening under Sandstone Hill. By the time he finished, the judge's expression had gone from polite interest to something harder, more focused. "We'll need to see that folder," Harris said at last. Jaden nodded. "I hid it in the school basement. I can get it before morning, but they're still looking for me." The judge leaned back in his chair, considering. "Then we'll make sure they don't find you first." For the first time since he'd stepped into the cave, Jaden felt the faint stirrings of safety, though he knew the night wasn't over. The men in the truck wouldn't give up, not now, and if they found out he was here, the Walker Ranch might become as dangerous as the hillside he'd escaped. But for the moment, there was a plan, and that was enough to keep him moving forward into whatever came next. Chapter 7. Unmasking and Consequences. Morning in Stoneford broke with a thin, pale light that seemed almost reluctant to spread across the hills. The air was crisp, the quiet of the early hour broken only by the faint hum of insects and the occasional creak of old wood in the cool breeze. Jaden had barely slept. The small guest room at the Walker Ranch had been a shelter, but his mind hadn't stopped replaying the events of the past day. The crawl through the cave, the weight of the inspector's folder pressed against his chest, the voices behind him, the steady prowl of the gray pickup. Even here, with the scent of strong coffee drifting in from the kitchen and the low murmur of men talking in the main room, he couldn't shake the sense that danger was still only a breath away. He found Judge Harris already at the table when he came out. The older man bent over a map of the town with a mug in one hand. Simon Walker stood beside him, arms folded across his chest, his expression grim. They both looked up when Jaden entered. "You ready to get that folder?" Harris asked without preamble. Jaden nodded. His stomach was knotted tight, but there was no hesitation in him now. The longer the evidence stayed hidden, the greater the risk it would be lost. And if they were going to bring the men from the cave to justice, they needed the proof in hand. They left the ranch in Simon's battered pickup just after sunrise, taking the long route into town to avoid any watchers who might still be lingering near the direct road. The streets were mostly empty when they arrived, only a few shopkeepers sweeping their stoops and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Jaden led them around to the back of the school, where the paint was peeling in long strips and the small basement window sat half-hidden behind a stack of broken desks. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked the frame open, the familiar groan of the hinges making his chest tighten. He slipped inside, the dim light filtering through the dust-choked glass casting the room in a muted haze. The filing cabinet was just as he had left it. He wedged his shoulder against it and pushed until the gap at the back opened enough for his hand to reach in. His fingers closed around the stiff leather of the folder, and relief flooded him so sharply it almost made his knees weak. He pulled it free, cradling it against him for a moment before climbing back out into the morning light. Judge Harris took it without a word, flipping it open just far enough to confirm the contents, then closing it again with a decisive snap. "Let's go," he said. "The town needs to hear this." By the time they reached the square, word had already spread that Judge Harris was in town. A small crowd had gathered near the steps of the old municipal hall, drawn by curiosity and the quiet energy of something about to happen. Harris moved to the top step, Simon beside him, and Jaden found himself standing just behind, the folder still in the judge's hands. Harris's voice carried with the kind of authority that made people listen. He began by explaining who he was, why he was here, and then, without ceremony, he laid out the facts from the folder: maps of illegal tunnels, forged inspection reports, photographs of hidden caches of ore. He spoke of the inspector whose badge had been found buried under a deliberate pile of rocks in Sandstone Cave, of how the evidence in Jaden's possession tied his murder directly to an operation that had enriched a handful of men at the expense of federal law. The crowd shifted and murmured, faces turning toward one another in disbelief, then outrage. Jaden could see the moment recognition clicked for some of them, names that had been whispered for years suddenly laid bare in the sunlight. Harris didn't stop there. He pointed to the date stamps on the documents showing how recent they were, how the operation was still ongoing even as they stood there. And then he named the man who had orchestrated it, Matthew Randolph, owner of the largest construction company in the county, whose influence reached into every office and committee in Stoneford. The reaction was immediate. A few gasps, some sharp intakes of breath, and then a rising tide of voices, angry, incredulous, demanding. Randolph himself wasn't in sight, but Jaden felt the crowd's attention turn sharply, like the tilt of a compass needle toward true north. Harris raised a hand for quiet, his expression hard. "This is not speculation," he said. "This is documented fact, corroborated by physical evidence and the testimony of a witness who risked his life to bring it forward." He glanced back at Jaden then, and for the first time since this had begun, Jaden felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He kept his chin up, though his heart thudded painfully against his ribs. The sound of an engine cut through the crowd's noise, and heads turned toward the street. The gray pickup rolled into view, flanked by two other vehicles. Randolph was in the passenger seat, his face tight and unreadable, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding at the hall steps. The vehicles stopped, and his men stepped out, hard-faced, broad-shouldered, the kind of men who moved with the confidence of those used to being obeyed. For a heartbeat, the square went utterly still. Then Judge Harris's voice rang out again, calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Matthew Randolph, you are under arrest for the murder of a federal mine inspector, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple violations of federal mining and land use statutes." The men in the crowd nearest the steps instinctively drew back, giving space as two deputy marshals emerged from a side street, badges gleaming in the morning sun. Randolph's expression shifted, just a flicker, but enough to show he understood the gravity of the moment. One of his men took a step forward, his hand twitching toward the hem of his jacket, but the marshals were faster. Weapons drawn, they closed the distance, their voices firm and unyielding. "Hands where we can see them." Randolph raised his hands slowly, a tight smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. The crowd erupted then, not in cheers, not yet, but in a low, fierce murmur that felt like the first stirring of something long suppressed. The marshals cuffed Randolph and led him toward their vehicle, his men following under guard. Harris turned back to the crowd. "This is not the end," he said. "There will be more arrests, more questions, and more truths uncovered. But this is the first step toward taking back your town." The words seemed to settle over the square like a promise, and for the first time since he'd stepped into the cave, Jaden felt something like hope take root in his chest. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines, court dates, and testimony. Randolph and several associates were held without bail, the evidence from the folder forming the backbone of the prosecution's case. The inspector's remains were recovered from the cave and given a proper burial. His name, Samuel Ortiz, was etched into a granite headstone that stood now in the small cemetery at the edge of town, the inscription marking him as a man who had died in service to justice. On a clear afternoon, 3 months later, Jaden stood beside that grave. The air smelled of cut grass and sun-warmed earth, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere beyond the fence. He held a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the ridge paths, and set them gently at the base of the headstone. He thought of the first time he'd seen the inspector's badge gleaming faintly in the cave's gloom, of the cold shock that had run through him then, and of everything that had happened since. It felt distant now, like a story told about someone else, but the memory of the fear, the weight of the decision to keep moving forward, remained sharp. Behind him, footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path. He turned to see Simon Walker approaching, his hat in his hands. The older man gave a nod toward the headstone. "You did right by him," he said simply. Jaden didn't answer right away, just looked back at the name carved into the stone. "I just found him," he said at last. "You and Judge Harris made sure it meant something." Simon's mouth twitched in the barest hint of a smile. "Took all of us," he said, "but you started it. Don't forget that." As they walked back toward the gate, Jaden glanced once more over his shoulder at the grave. The flowers stirred in the breeze, their petals catching the sunlight. He didn't know what the future held for Stoneford or for himself, but he knew that the truth, once dragged into the open, had a way of changing everything it touched. And sometimes that truth started in the dark, carried forward by the smallest of decisions, until it stood in the light for everyone to see. He kept that thought close as they stepped out of the cemetery and back into the waiting day. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We have many more captivating stories, behind-the-scenes insights, and thought-provoking moments coming your way. After you finish here, check out our next videos for a continuation of the journey, and explore our other uploads to discover even more topics and narratives you might love. Sharing this video with friends, family, or on your social media helps us grow and brings more people into the conversation, so we can keep creating content that matters. Your support means the world. Subscribe, keep watching, and share the experience.